Welcome to Legends Unlocked, where ancient myths breathe again. We begin in the heart of Egypt, a land of gods and mysteries. The feather of Ma'at, the judgment of the heart, the secrets of the afterlife. But this is only the beginning. We will travel from Nile to Norse, from pyramids to palaces, unlocking legends from every corner of the world. Every myth holds a truth. Every symbol, a message. Every legend, a lesson. Join us on this journey through time, mystery, and meaning. Subscribe now and unlock the wisdom of the ancients.
Luxor Temple is a large and complex ancient Egyptian temple located on the east bank of the Nile River in the city of Luxor, historically known as Thebes. It was founded around 1400 BCE. The temple was built for the god Ammonius-Ra, his consort Mut, and their son Khonsu. Construction of Luxor Temple took place during the reigns of kings from the 18th and 19th dynasties. The most significant structures within the temple were built by kings Amenhotep III and Ramses II. Ramses II added the open courtyard, the monumental pylon, the grand gateway, and two obelisks. King Thutmose III built chapels dedicated to the Theban triad, Ammonius, Mut, Khonsu, and Tutankhamun completed the wall inscriptions. The original triple shrine, built during the reigns of Queen Hatshepsut and King Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty, was later destroyed but then rebuilt by Ramses II. The temple is also known as Ipit Resit, meaning the southern sanctuary or the place of Ammonius-Ra, and is considered one of the best preserved and most beautifully constructed Egyptian temples, exemplifying classic Egyptian temple design. During the Middle Kingdom period, the site where Amenhotep III built the current temple contained remains of an older temple and a sacred chapel likely dating back to the 12th dynasty. Amenhotep III is credited with building the temple in its current form on the east bank of the Nile, aligned on a north-south axis. Queen Hatshepsut and King Thutmose III constructed a small building with three chapels dedicated to the Theban triad. It is believed that Ramses II rebuilt these chapels and inscribed his name on them. Ramses II, a 19th dynasty ruler, added a large pylon and behind it a spacious courtyard lined with papyrus columned colonnades. Ancient architects typically oriented temples on the east bank of the Nile along a west-east axis and those on the west bank along an east-west axis. However, Luxor Temple on the east bank is uniquely aligned along a north-south axis, possibly to align with the nearby Karnak Temple complex to the north and the Avenue of Sphinxes, Avenue of the Rams, connecting the two temples. It is likely that Ramses II's architects adjusted the axes of the additions he made, including the pylon and courtyard, to fit with the earlier constructions by Amenhotep III and the rebuilt triple shrine from the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Amenhotep III is believed to have commissioned the temple dedicated to the Theban triad for two main reasons. First, to emphasize his divine lineage from Ammonius himself, and second, to appease the powerful priests of Ammonius to gain their acceptance as the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt. Thus, the temple was dedicated to Ammonius and his divine image. The entrance to Luxor Temple is marked by the first pylon, standing 24 meters high, built by Ramses II. This pylon is decorated with scenes of Ramses II's military victories, notably the Battle of Kadesh. Later pharaohs, especially those of the 25th dynasty, also recorded their triumphs here. Two massive pink granite obelisks once stood before Ramses II's pylon. One of these obelisks now adorns the Place de la Concorde in Paris and weighs approximately 220 tons. The eastern obelisk, still standing before the northern pylon, weighs around 257 tons and is notable for the carved monkeys on its base, depicted worshipping the sun at sunrise. Both obelisks bear hieroglyphic inscriptions of Ramses II's names and titles and show him offering sacrifices at their apexes. These obelisks not only symbolized the sun and proclaimed the temple's location from afar, but also had pointed tops likely covered with a gold-plated copper layer, keeping them gleaming and radiant. Ramses II also constructed the massive pylon at the temple's entrance, measuring 65 meters wide and 24 meters high. On its western wing, deep reliefs depict Ramses II's battles against the Hittites in his 5th regnal year. The scenes include Ramses with his military advisors, the defeated enemy camp, and the king in his chariot amid battle. On the eastern wing, Ramses is shown in his war chariot raining arrows down upon fleeing Hittite enemies, with the battlefield strewn with dead and wounded. In the far north of this wing is a depiction of the Hittite prince of Kadesh, portrayed as frightened in his chariot. A poetic description of the battle, written in ancient Egyptian, extends from the right western wing to the eastern wing's lower part. The pylon's facade contains 4 vertical niches, 2 on each wing, designed to hold flagpoles, and 4 openings at the top where the flagpoles were secured. In front of the pylon were originally 6 colossal statues of Ramses II, 4 standing and 2 seated on either side of the entrance. Only one standing statue remains, positioned on the far right from the interior perspective. The 2 seated statues flanking the doorway show Ramses II on his throne. The sides of the throne display scenes symbolizing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. A small statue of Queen Nefertari appears beside the left-seated statue, and a statue of a princess beside the right one. The bases of both statues are carved with images of prisoners and their names inscribed on their chests. Each statue is approximately 14 meters tall. Ramses II also built the temple's courtyard, measuring 57 meters long and 51 meters wide. Notably, the courtyard's axis deviates eastward from the temple's main axis, possibly to face Karnak Temple or to avoid the chapels constructed earlier by Hatshepsut and Thutmose III in the current location. The courtyard is surrounded by porticos, each supported by 2 rows of papyrus columns. This avenue is a paved road flanked by rows of Sphinx statues representing King Nectanebo I of the 30th dynasty, who established this path during his reign. The avenue led to the Temple of Khonsu, located south of Karnak temples, replacing the earlier Avenue of Rams, Avenue of the Sphinxes, dating back to the reign of Amenhotep III, as evidenced by some statues bearing Amenhotep III's name near Khonsu Temple's southern gate. Each Sphinx statue was carved from a single block of sandstone, depicting a lion's body with King Nectanebo's head, placed on rectangular bases. The purpose of the Avenue of the Sphinxes was to delineate the procession route, whether royal or divine, and to emphasize its axis visually.
Welcome to Legends Unlocked, where ancient myths breathe again. We begin in the heart of Egypt, a land of gods and mysteries, the feather of Ma'at, the judgment of the heart, the secrets of the afterlife. But this is only the beginning. We will travel from Nile to Norse, from pyramids to palaces, unlocking legends from every corner of the world. Every myth holds a truth, every symbol a message, every legend a lesson. Join us on this journey through time, mystery, and meaning. Subscribe now and unlock the wisdom of the ancients.
a long, low, level shore, scarcely rising above the sea, a chain of vaguely defined and ever-shifting lakes and marshes, then the triangular plain beyond, whose apex is thrust 30 leagues into the land. This, the delta of Egypt, has gradually been acquired from the sea, and is, as it were, the gift of the Nile. The Mediterranean once reached to the foot of the sandy plateau on which stand the pyramids, and formed a wide gulf where now stretches plain beyond plain of the delta. The last undulations of the Arabian hills, from Gebel Makhatam to Gebel Genefa, were its boundaries on the east, while a sinuous and shallow channel running between Africa and Asia united the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Westward, the littoral followed closely the contour of the Libyan plateau, but a long limestone spur broke away from it at about 31 degrees north, and terminated in Cape Abukir. The alluvial deposits first tilled up the depths of the bay, and then, under the influence of the currents which swept along its eastern coasts, accumulated behind that rampart of sandhills, whose remains are still to be seen near Benha. Thus was formed a miniature delta, whose structure pretty accurately corresponded with that of the great delta of today. Here the Nile divided into 3 divergent streams, roughly coinciding with the southern courses of the Rosetta and Damietta branches, and with the modern canal of Abu Menega. The ceaseless accumulation of mud brought down by the river soon overpassed the first limits, and steadily encroached upon the sea until it was carried beyond the shelter furnished by Cape Abukir. Thence it was gathered into the great littoral current, flowing from Africa to Asia, and formed an incurvated coastline ending in the headland of Cassios, on the Syrian frontier. From that time Egypt made no further increase towards the north, and her coast remains practically such as it was thousands of years ago. The interior alone has suffered change, having been dried up, hardened, and gradually raised. Its inhabitants thought they could measure the exact length of time in which this work of creation had been accomplished. According to the Egyptians, Menes, the first of their mortal kings, had found, so they said, the valley under water. The sea came in almost as far as the Fayum, and excepting the province of Thebes, the whole country was a pestilential swamp. Hence the necessary period for the physical formation of Egypt would cover some centuries after Menes. This is no longer considered a sufficient length of time, and some modern geologists declare that the Nile must have worked at the formation of its own estuary for at least 74,000 years. This figure is certainly exaggerated, for the alluvium would gain on the shallows of the ancient Gulf far more rapidly than it gains upon the depths of the Mediterranean. But even though we reduce the period, we must still admit that the Egyptians little suspected the true age of their country. Not only did the delta long precede the coming of Menes, but its plain was entirely completed before the first arrival of the Egyptians. The Greeks, full of the mysterious virtues which they attributed to numbers, discovered that there were 7 principal branches, and 7 mouths of the Nile, and that as compared with these, the rest were but false mouths. As a matter of fact, there were only 3 chief outlets. The Canopic branch flowed westward, and fell into the Mediterranean near Cape Abukir, at the western extremity of the arc described by the coastline. The Peleusaic branch followed the length of the Arabian chain, and flowed forth at the other extremity, and the Sebennytic stream almost bisected the triangle contained between the Canopic and Peleusaic channels. 2,000 years ago, these branches separated from the main river at the city of Circasaurus, nearly 4 miles north of the site where Cairo now stands. But after the Peleusaic branch had ceased to exist, the fork of the river gradually wore away from the land from age to age, and is now some 9 miles lower down. These 3 great waterways are united by a network of artificial rivers and canals, and by ditches, some natural, others dug by the hand of man, but all ceaselessly shifting. They silt up, close, open again, replace each other, and ramify in innumerable branches over the surface of the soil, spreading life and fertility on all sides. As the land rises towards the south, this web contracts and is less confused, while black mold and cultivation alike dwindle, and the fawn-colored line of the desert comes into sight. The Libyan and Arabian hills appear above the plain, draw nearer to each other, and gradually shut in the horizon until it seems as though they would unite. And there the delta ends, and Egypt proper has begun. It is only a strip of vegetable mold stretching north and south between the regions of drought and desolation, a prolonged oasis on the banks of the river, made by the Nile and sustained by the Nile. The whole length of the land is shut in between two ranges of hills, roughly parallel at a mean distance of about 12 miles. During the earlier ages, the river filled all this intermediate space, and the sides of the hills, polished, worn, blackened to their very summits, still bear the unmistakable traces of its action. Wasted and shrunken within the depths of its ancient bed, the stream now makes a way through its own thick deposits of mud. The bulk of its waters keep to the east, and constitutes the true Nile, the great river of the hieroglyphic inscriptions. A second arm flows close to the Libyan desert, here and there formed into canals, elsewhere left to follow its own course. From the head of the delta to the village of Demt it is called the Bahr Yusuf. Beyond Derut, up to Gebel Silsila, it is the Ibrahimiyya, the Sohagiyya, the Rayan. But the ancient names are unknown to us. The western Nile dries up in winter throughout all its upper courses, where it continues to flow. It is by scanty accessions from the main Nile. It also divides north of Hanasiyya, and by the gorge of Ilahun sends out a branch which passes beyond the hills into the basin of the Fayum. The true Nile, the eastern Nile, is less a river than a sinuous lake encumbered with islets and sandbanks, and its navigable channel winds capriciously between them, flowing with a strong and steady current below the steep, black banks cut sheer through the alluvial earth. There are light groves of the date palm, groups of acacia trees and sycamores, square patches of barley or of wheat, fields of beans or of bersim, and here and there a long bank of sand which the least breeze raises into whirling clouds. And over all there broods a great silence, scarcely broken by the cry of birds, or the song of rowers in a passing boat. Something of human life may stir on the banks, but it is softened into poetry by distance. A half-veiled woman, bearing a bundle of herbs upon her head, is driving her goats before her. An irregular line of asses or of laden camels emerges from one hollow of the undulating road, only to disappear within another. A group of peasants, crouched upon the shore, in the ancient posture of knees to chin, patiently awaits the return of the ferry-boat. A dainty village looks forth smiling from beneath its palm trees. Near at hand it is all naked filth and ugliness, a cluster of low grey huts built of mud and lath, 2 or 3 taller houses, whitewashed, an enclosed square shaded by sycamores, a few old men, each seated peacefully at his own door, a confusion of fowls, children, goats, and sheep, half a dozen boats made fast ashore. But as we pass on, the wretchedness all fades away, meanness of detail is lost in light, and long before it disappears at a bend of the river, the village is again clothed with gaiety and serene beauty. Day by day, the landscape repeats itself. The same groups of trees alternate with the same fields, growing green or dusty in the sunlight according to the season of the year. With the same measured flow, the Nile winds beneath its steep banks and about its scattered islands. One village succeeds another, each alike smiling and sorted under its crown of foliage. The terraces of the Libyan hills, away beyond the western Nile, scarcely rise above the horizon, and lie like a white edging between the green of the plain and the blue of the sky. The Arabian hills do not form one unbroken line, but a series of mountain masses with their spurs, now approaching the river, and now withdrawing to the desert at almost regular intervals. At the entrance to the valley rise Gebel Mokattam and Gebel el Ahmar. Gebel Hemer Shemul and Gebel Sheikh Embarak next stretch in echelon from north to south, and are succeeded by Gebel et Ter, where, according to an old legend, all the birds of the world are annually assembled. Then follows Gebel Abu Feda, dreaded by the sailors for its sudden gusts. Limestone predominates throughout, white or yellowish, broken by veins of alabaster or of red and grey sandstones. Its horizontal strata are so symmetrically laid one above another as to seem more like the walls of a town than the side of a mountain. But time has often dismantled their summits and loosened their foundations. Man has broken into their facades to cut his quarries and his tombs. while the current is secretly undermining the base, wherein it has made many a breach. As soon as any margin of mud has collected between cliffs and river, halfa and wild plants take hold upon it, and date palms grow there, whence their seed no one knows. Presently a hamlet rises at the mouth of the ravine, among clusters of trees and fields in miniature. Beyond Siut, the light becomes more glowing, the air drier and more vibrating, and the green of cultivation loses its brightness. The angular outline of the dome palm mingles more and more with that of the common palm and the heavy sycamore, and the castor oil plant increasingly abounds. But all these changes come about so gradually that they are effected before we notice them. The plain continues to contract. At Thebes it is still 10 miles wide. At the gorge of Gebelim it has almost disappeared, and at Gebel Silsila it has completely vanished. There it was crossed by a natural dike of sandstone, through which the waters have with difficulty scooped for themselves a passage. From this point, Egypt is nothing but the bed of the Nile lying between two escarpments of naked rock. Further on, the cultivable land reappears, but narrowed and changed almost beyond recognition. Hills, hewn out of solid sandstone, succeed each other at distances of about 2 miles, low, crushed, somber, and formless. Presently a forest of palm trees, the last on that side, announces Aswan and Nubia. 5 banks of granite, ranged in lines between latitude 24 degrees and 18 degrees north, cross Nubia from east to west, and from northeast to southwest, like so many ramparts thrown up between the Mediterranean and the heart of Africa. The Nile has attacked them from behind, and made its way over them one after another in rapids, which have been glorified by the name of cataracts. Classic writers were pleased to describe the river as hurled into the gulfs of Sin with so great a roar that the people of the neighborhood were deafened by it. Even a colony of Persians, sent thither by Cambyses, could not bear the noise of the falls, and went forth to seek a quieter situation. The first cataract is a kind of sloping and sinuous passage 6 1/4 miles in length, descending from the island of Philae to the port of Aswan, the aspect of its approach relieved and brightened by the evergreen groves of Elephantine. Beyond Elephantine are cliffs of sandy beaches, chains of blackened roches moutonnées marking out the beds of the currents, and fantastic reefs, sometimes bare and sometimes veiled by long grasses and climbing plants, in which thousands of birds have made their nests. There are islets, too, occasionally large enough to have once supported something of a population, such as Emerald, Salug, Sahil. The granite threshold of Nubia is broken beyond Sahil, but its debris, massed in disorder against the right bank, still seem to dispute the passage of the waters, dashing turbulently and roaring as they flow along through tortuous channels, where every streamlet is broken up into small cascades. The channel running by the left bank is always navigable. During the inundation, the rocks and sandbanks of the right are completely under water, and their presence is only betrayed by eddies. But on the river's reaching its lowest point, a fall of some 6 feet is established, and there big boats, hugging the shore, are hauled up by means of ropes, or easily drift down with the current.
Welcome to Legends Unlocked, where ancient myths breathe again. We begin in the heart of Egypt, a land of gods and mysteries, the feather of Ma'at, the judgment of the heart, the secrets of the afterlife. But this is only the beginning. We will travel from Nile to Norse, from pyramids to palaces, unlocking legends from every corner of the world. Every myth holds a truth, every symbol a message, every legend a lesson. Join us on this journey through time, mystery, and meaning. Subscribe now and unlock the wisdom of the ancients.
All kinds of granite are found together in this corner of Africa. There are the pink and red syenites, porphyritic granite, yellow granite, gray granite, both black granite and white, and granites veined with black and veined with white. As soon as these disappear behind us, various sandstones begin to crop up, allied to the coarsest calcaire grossier. The hills bristle with small split blocks, with peaks half overturned, with rough and denuded mounds. League beyond league, they stretch in low, ignoble outline. Here and there a valley opens sharply into the desert, revealing an infinite perspective of summits and escarpments in echelon, one behind another, to the furthest plane of the horizon, like motionless caravans. The now confined river rushes on with a low, deep murmur, accompanied night and day by the croaking of frogs and the rhythmic creak of the sakia. Jetties of rough stonework, made in unknown times by an unknown people, run out like breakwaters into midstream. From time to time waves of sand are borne over, and drown the narrow fields of durra and of barley. Scraps of close, aromatic pasturage, acacias, date palms, and dome palms, together with a few shriveled sycamores, are scattered along both banks. The ruins of a crumbling pylon mark the site of some ancient city, and overhanging the water is a vertical wall of rock honeycombed with tombs. Amid these relics of another age, miserable huts, scattered hamlets, a town or two surrounded with little gardens are the only evidence that there is yet life in Nubia. South of Wadi Halfa, the second granite bank is broken through, and the second cataract spreads its rapids over a length of 4 leagues. The archipelago numbers more than 350 islets, of which some 60 have houses upon them and yield harvest to their inhabitants. The main characteristics of the first 2 cataracts are repeated with slight variation in the cases of the 3 which follow, at Hanak, at Gerendid, and El Humar. It is Egypt still, but a joyless Egypt bereft of its brightness, impoverished, disfigured, and almost desolate. There is the same double wall of hills, now closely confining the valley, and again withdrawing from each other as though to flee into the desert. Everywhere are moving sheets of sand, steep black banks with their narrow strips of cultivation, villages which are scarcely visible on account of the lowness of their huts. Sycamore ceases at Gebel Barkal, date palms become fewer and finally disappear. The Nile alone has not changed. And it was at Philae, so it is at Berber. Here, however, on the right bank, 600 leagues from the sea, is its first effluent, the Takaze, which intermittently brings to it the waters of northern Ethiopia. At Khartoum, the single channel in which the river flowed divides, and 2 other streams are opened up in a southerly direction, each of them apparently equal in volume to the main stream. Which is the true Nile? Is it the Blue Nile, which seems to come down from the distant mountains? Or is it the White Nile, which has traversed the immense plains of equatorial Africa? The old Egyptians never knew. The river kept the secret of its source from them as obstinately as it withheld it from us until a few years ago. Vainly did their victorious armies follow the Nile for months together as they pursued the tribes who dwelt upon its banks, only to find it as wide, as full, as irresistible in its progress as ever. It was a freshwater sea, and sea, Eoma, was the name by which they called it. The Egyptians, therefore, never sought its source. They imagined the whole universe to be a large box, nearly rectangular in form, whose greatest diameter was from south to north, and its least from east to west. The earth, with its alternate continents and seas, formed the bottom of the box. It was a narrow, oblong, and slightly concave floor, with Egypt in its center. The sky stretched over it like an iron ceiling, flat according to some, vaulted according to others. Its earthward face was capriciously sprinkled with lamps hung from strong cables, and which, extinguished or unperceived by day, were lighted or became visible to our eyes at night. Since this ceiling could not remain in mid-air without support, 4 columns, or rather 4 forked trunks of trees, similar to those which maintained the primitive house, were supposed to uphold it. But it was doubtless feared lest some tempest should overturn them, for they were superseded by 4 lofty peaks, rising at the 4 cardinal points, and connected by a continuous chain of mountains. The Egyptians knew little of the northern peak, the Mediterranean, the very green, interposed between it and Egypt, and prevented their coming near enough to see it. The southern peak was named Apit, the Horn of the Earth. That on the east was called Bakhu, the Mountain of Birth, and the western peak was known as Manu, sometimes as Onkhit, the Region of Life. Bakhu was not a fictitious mountain, but the highest of those distant summits seen from the Nile and looking towards the Red Sea. In the same way, Manu answered to some hill of the Libyan desert, whose summit closed the horizon. When it was discovered that neither Bakhu nor Manu were the limits of the world, the notion of upholding the celestial roof was not on that account given up. It was only necessary to withdraw the pillars from sight, and imagine fabulous peaks invested with familiar names. These were not supposed to form the actual boundary of the universe. A great river, analogous to the ocean stream of the Greeks, lay between them and its utmost limits. This river circulated upon a kind of ledge projecting along the sides of the box, a little below the continuous mountain chain upon which the starry heavens were sustained. On the north of the ellipse, the river was bordered by a steep and abrupt bank, which took its rise at the peak of Manu on the west, and soon rose high enough to form a screen between the river and the earth. The narrow valley which hid it from view was known as Da'it from remotest times. Eternal night enfolded that valley in thick darkness and filled it with dense air such as no living being could breathe. Towards the east the steep bank rapidly declined and ceased altogether, a little beyond Bakhu, while the river flowed on between low and almost level shores from east to south, and then from south to west. The sun was a disk of fire placed upon a boat. At the same equable rate, the river carried it round the ramparts of the world. From evening until morning it disappeared within the gorges of Da'it. Its light did not then reach us, and it was night. From morning until evening its rays, being no longer intercepted by any obstacle, were freely shed abroad from one end of the box to the other, and it was day. The Nile branched off from the celestial river at its southern bend. Hence the south was the chief cardinal point to the Egyptians, and by that they oriented themselves, placing sunrise to their left and sunset to their right. Before they passed beyond the defiles of Gebel Silsila, they thought that the spot whence the celestial waters left the sky was situate between Elephantine and Philae, and that they descended in an immense waterfall whose last leaps were at Syene. It may be that the tales about the first cataract, told by classical writers, are but a far-off echo of this tradition of a barbarous age. Conquests carried into the heart of Africa forced the Egyptians to recognize their error, but did not weaken their faith in the supernatural origin of the river. They only placed its source farther south, and surrounded it with greater marvels. They told how, by going up the stream, sailors at length reached an undetermined country, a kind of borderland between this world and the next, a land of shades, whose inhabitants were dwarves, monsters, or spirits. Thence they passed into a sea sprinkled with mysterious islands, like those enchanted archipelagos which Portuguese and Breton mariners were wont to see at times when on their voyages, and which vanished at their approach. These islands were inhabited by serpents with human voices, sometimes friendly and sometimes cruel to the shipwrecked. He who went forth from the islands could never more re-enter them. They were resolved into the waters and lost within the bosom of the waves. A modern geographer can hardly comprehend such fancies. Those of Greek and Roman times were perfectly familiar with them. They believed that the Nile communicated with the Red Sea near Suakin by means of the Astaboras, and this was certainly the route which the Egyptians of old had imagined for their navigators. The supposed communication was gradually transferred farther and farther south, and we have only to glance over certain maps of the 16th and 17th centuries to see clearly drawn what the Egyptians had imagined: the center of Africa as a great lake, whence issued the Congo, the Zambezi, and the Nile. Arab merchants of the Middle Ages believed that a resolute man could pass from Alexandria or Cairo to the land of the Zinjis and the Indian Ocean by rising from river to river. Many of the legends relating to this subject are lost, while others have been collected and embellished with fresh features by Jewish and Christian theologians. The Nile was said to have its source in Paradise, to traverse burning regions inaccessible to man, and afterwards to fall into a sea whence it made its way to Egypt. Sometimes it carried down from its celestial sources branches and fruits unlike any to be found on earth. The sea mentioned in all these tales is perhaps a less extravagant invention than we are at first inclined to think. A lake, nearly as large as the Victoria Nyanza, once covered the marshy plain where the Bahr el Abiad unites with the Sobat and with the Bahr el Ghazal. Alluvial deposits have filled up all but its deepest depression, which is known as Birket Nu. But in ages preceding our own, it must still have been vast enough to suggest to Egyptian soldiers and boatmen the idea of an actual sea opening into the Indian Ocean. The mountains, whose outline was vaguely seen far to southward on the further shores, doubtless contained within them its mysterious source. There the inundation was made ready, and there it began upon a fixed day. The celestial Nile had its periodic rise and fall, on which those of the earthly Nile depended. Every year, towards the middle of June, Isis, mourning for Osiris, let fall into it one of the tears which she shed over her brother, and thereupon the river swelled and descended upon earth. Isis has had no devotees for centuries, and her very name is unknown to the descendants of her worshippers, but the tradition of her fertilizing tears has survived her memory. Even to this day, everyone in Egypt, Mussulman or Christian, knows that a divine drop falls from heaven during the night between the 17th and 18th of June, and forthwith brings about the rise of the Nile. Swollen by the rains which fall in February over the region of the Great Lakes, the White Nile rushes northward, sweeping before it the stagnant sheets of water left by the inundation of the previous year. On the left, the Bahr el Ghazal brings it to the overflow of the ill-defined basin stretching between Darfur and the Congo, and the Sobat pours in on the right a tribute from the rivers which furrow the southern slopes of the Abyssinian mountains. The first swell passes Khartoum by the end of April, and raises the water level there by about a foot. Then it slowly makes its way through Nubia, and dies away in Egypt at the beginning of June. Its waters, infected by half-putrid organic matter from the equatorial swamps, are not completely freed from it even in the course of this long journey, but keep a greenish tint as far as the delta. They are said to be poisonous, and to give severe pains in the bladder to any who may drink them. I am bound to say that every June, for 5 years, I drank this green water from the Nile itself, without taking any other precaution than the usual one of filtering it through a porous jar. Neither I, nor the many people living with me, ever felt the slightest inconvenience from it. Happily, this green Nile does not last long, but generally flows away in 3 or 4 days, and is only the forerunner of the real flood. The melting of the snows and the excessive spring rains having suddenly swollen the torrents which rise in the central plateau of Abyssinia, the Blue Nile, into which they flow, rolls so impetuously towards the plain that, when its waters reach Khartoum in the middle of May, they refuse to mingle with those of the White Nile, and do not use their peculiar color before reaching the neighborhood of Abu Hamad, 300 miles below. From that time the height of the Nile increases rapidly day by day. The river, constantly reinforced by floods following one upon another from the Great Lakes and from Abyssinia, rises in furious bounds, and would become a devastating torrent were its rage not checked by the Nubian cataracts. Here 6 basins, one above another, in which the water collects, check its course, and permit it to flow thence only as a partially filtered and moderated stream. It is signalled at Syene towards the 8th of June, at Cairo by the 17th to the 20th, and there its birth is officially celebrated during the night of the drop. 2 days later it reaches the delta, just in time to save the country from drought and sterility. Egypt, burnt up by the Khamsin, a west wind blowing continuously for 50 days, seems nothing more than an extension of the desert. The trees are covered and choked by a layer of grey dust. About the villages, meagre and laboriously watered patches of vegetables struggle for life, while some show of green still lingers along the canals and in hollows whence all moisture has not yet evaporated. The plain lies panting in the sun, naked, dusty, and ashen, scored with intersecting cracks as far as the eye can see. The Nile is only half its usual width, and holds not more than 1/20th of the volume of water which is borne down in October. It has at first hard work to recover its former bed, and attains it by such subtle gradations that the rise is scarcely noted. It is, however, continually gaining ground. Here a sandbank is covered, There an empty channel is filled. Islets are outlined where there was a continuous beach. A new stream detaches itself and gains the old shore. The first contact is disastrous to the banks. Their steep sides, disintegrated and cracked by the heat, no longer offer any resistance to the current, and fall with a crash in lengths of 100 yards and more.
Welcome to Legends Unlocked, where ancient myths breathe again. We begin in the heart of Egypt, a land of gods and mysteries, the feather of Ma'at, the judgment of the heart, the secrets of the afterlife. But this is only the beginning. We will travel from Nile to Norse, from pyramids to palaces, unlocking legends from every corner of the world. Every myth holds a truth, every symbol a message, every legend a lesson. Join us on this journey through time, mystery, and meaning. Subscribe now and unlock the wisdom of the ancients.
In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The first words of the Bible. Clearly not a scientific statement, and never intended as one. But as a symbolic statement, it's not so far wrong, because the appearance of civilized man does seem to have taken place with the suddenness of a sunrise. The evolution of this figure, whom we know from skulls, with low forehead and crunching jaws, who came out of his cave to hunt and eat, into this man living in a shining hall with geometrical proportions and recording the passage of time in beautiful hieroglyphics. This process, which by evolutionary standards should have taken millions of years, seems to have taken only a few hundred. Where did it happen? Historians give contradictory answers, as one archaeological discovery cancels out the other. But from ancient times, people have believed that it happened in Egypt. When did it happen? There we can give a clearer answer, because most people believe that civilization first appeared about 5,000 years ago, both in the Nile Valley and in Mesopotamia. The cities of Mesopotamia rose and fell, but Egypt remained a social unit for almost 3,000 years. How did it happen? Well, I've come out here to describe some of the stages in this almost incredible event. What happened in the beginning? We find the answer in the earliest Egyptian art. From about the year 2800 BC, it reveals nearly all the qualities that we value in civilization. A sense of beauty and of the dignity of man. A well-organized government run by responsible men. A belief that man could be inspired by the gods. An awareness of nature as something very close to ourselves, which could be beautiful as well as useful. A sense of clarity and order. Geometry and its application to design in sculpture and architecture. All these qualities appear in Egypt 1,000 years before they appear anywhere else. What made possible this miraculous development? Well, for once the answer is simple. The river Nile. The country has virtually no rainfall. The greater part is desert, but the heavy rains in distant Ethiopia caused the Nile to flood every summer. In the autumn, the floods receded and the land, flooded with absolute regularity, was extremely fertile. It and it alone supported life. It was Egypt. All around stretched the barren desert. Pouring northwards over the cataracts of the Nubian hills, the Nile floods brought with them silt, a rich deposit of fresh earth which was left behind every year when the floods went down. The Greek historian Herodotus rightly said, Egypt was the gift of the Nile. Very early, the Egyptians learned how to profit from this unique situation. They lived mainly on the desert shelf and came down to collect water. They built canals, dug wells, constructed water wheels, cultivated and herded. Living in a climate of almost unvarying good weather, dependent on a regular and, as they supposed, God-given natural event, they became adept at its conservation and, in consequence, intensely conservative. The Nile ran from south to north, so that the sun made a complete arc over it. The sun rose in the east, and it was on the east bank that they built their cities. It died in the west, and it was on the west bank that they buried their dead. Light, the sun, water, were life. Darkness and the desert were death. They worshipped the sun under various titles. They thought that it died every night and was reborn. They believed in the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the body. They believed that good deeds would be rewarded in afterlife. What a leap forward of the human mind from the days of voodoo and human sacrifice. Politically, the crucial step was taken in about 3000 BC. The separate Stone Age communities along the Nile were welded together by a warlike king. Now the narrow strip of Upper Egypt and the wider fertile belt of Lower Egypt, the Delta, would work together. The benefits were immediate. The king who achieved this is thought to have been called Narmer. Here he is on a pallet, a sort of plate for offerings to the gods. Below him, the uniting of the two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt, the cooperation on which all the future prosperity of Egypt depended, is symbolized by the intersecting necks of these two monsters. This side is still rather voodooish, but the other side, depicting King Narmer, is clear and orderly, and already shows some of the characteristics of Egyptian art, especially the way in which the heads are turned in profile and the chests are frontal. "1,500 years later, the Egyptians were still commemorating the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, even as far south as Abu Simbel. The figures representing the two regions are binding together the lungs, the organs vital for life, and rightly so. Whenever the unity was threatened by the breakdown of central government, Egypt suffered. No transport, no building, no productive human life was possible without the Nile, and it has remained the center of life for the Egyptian peasant. Insofar as civilization is the triumph of stability over vicissitude, of order over chaos, and of confidence in renewal, the Nile was the perfect setting for its birth. Soon after 3000 BC, a new capital was established near the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. We refer to it by its Greek name, Memphis. Well, Memphis was repeatedly sacked and destroyed. Nothing to be seen now but palm trees. But a few miles away, on the first shelf of the desert, a king named Zoser built a royal retreat, half temple, half a place for peaceful rites and pleasure. And in the middle of it he built as his tomb the earliest pyramid. This is Saqqara, to my mind, one of the sacred places of the world, the real birthplace of civilization. First thing that strikes one about Saqqara is its lightness and clarity. It's built of an exquisite creamy golden limestone. It's the earliest stone building in the world. The cutting is of such perfection, never equaled in Greece or Rome. And the strange thing is that it's an imitation in stone of wooden architecture, even down to imitating in stone the ends of wooden beams. They wanted to make something permanent. This is the entrance, but the whole area of the sacred enclosure is surrounded by a wall in the same style, made of the same beautifully dressed and fitted stone. The love of perfection could not go further. Of course, there have been restorations, And to see what the original building was like, one must look at some sarcophagi of the same date, which reproduce ideal architecture. What a refined, sophisticated style. Very far from our idea of what ruins or primitive architecture should be, very far from Stonehenge, which was built considerably later. One can say that this row of pillars through which I'm walking is based on clusters of stems, but at the other end of the courtyard they turn into fluted columns, Doric columns, 2,000 years earlier than the Parthenon, except that they haven't disengaged themselves from the wall. Even the details that anticipate what we think of as an Egyptian style have a refinement that we might call classical. The oddest buildings of all are those that run along the north side of the court in which sacred festivals were held. What can they have been for? Were they little chapels? They're difficult to enter, and when one gets inside, there's a blank wall. But they have fluted columns of the utmost elegance, which lead up to capitals with holes for flagstaffs. One is completely baffled by the extreme sophistication and the incalculable purpose of this exquisite architecture. Combination of measuring mind and responsive hand cannot go further. The date, 2770 BC. Only a little of the precious outer covering of hewn stone remains on the pyramid, and the inner core has crumbled, so that it does look more barbaric. It's the earliest pyramid. Before that time, men have been buried in relatively modest tombs, and why King Zoser wanted to raise a pyramid of solid stone, we simply don't know. Deep underground in a tunnel nearby, there is a relief of King Zoser running a ritual race, a pose that was to survive all the way through Egyptian art for 3,000 years. Only it was more usually associated with victory than with religious ecstasy. In prehistoric times, kings had run an annual course to prove their continuing energy to rule, and this test may have survived as a ceremony. It has a glorious energy and elasticity. These people had a long run ahead of them. Zoser's body must have been in the tomb, which has been robbed, like every other royal tomb but one, but his likeness has come down to us in this little stone box. Battered but grandiose. The man who dominates Saqqara is not King Zoser, but a mysterious, haunting character named Imhotep. According to Egyptian legend, he was a sort of Prometheus, the first student of medicine, the first student of geometry, the first architect. Well, a fairly evolved architecture of brick and wattle did exist before his time. We can still see what it must have been like in contemporary dwellings very close to here. But Imhotep may have been, no, must have been, the first man to build in stone. No doubt he was a pioneer, and a universal man of almost legendary stature, a sort of Egyptian Leonardo da Vinci. He was buried at Saqqara, and recent excavators have found some posthumous likenesses of him. It's just conceivable that they may find his tomb. It should then become a place of pilgrimage for the whole civilized human race. It's in other tombs around Saqqara that almost all the finest works of art of the Old Kingdom have been found. These tombs were built to commemorate noblemen who were usually shown as a statue in a false entrance inside. And on the surrounding walls are scenes depicting human activity in a way that we hardly find again to the 15th century books of ours, or even Bruegel. As in a medieval calendar of the months, we can follow the seasons of the farmer's year. Asses tread in the seed. This is the standard method of sowing in the rich, damp soil of the delta. Harvesting. The scythes would have been stone blades. We're still in the Stone Age. The crop is loaded into rope baskets. The Nile had made Egypt the greatest wheat-producing country of the ancient world. The other source of natural wealth was gold. It was mined in the eastern desert and was one of the first metals to be worked. Here are artisans blowing down hollow reeds to keep the charcoal furnace at the right temperature for smelting the gold. The craftsmen who worked on the gold collars and jewelled headdresses were chosen for their grotesque size, either very tall or dwarfish, so that if they tried to steal or run away, they could easily be identified. These reliefs are also full of vitality. On a Nile boat, the boatmen were obviously as rowdy as Thames bargees. With what energy and zest the artist has portrayed this local brawl. In addition to their extraordinary record of human activity, these tombs also show us something very important about the early Egyptians, their love of animals and of nature generally. They show all the stages of animal husbandry. A bearded farmer helps in the birth of a calf. Cattle are driven across the river, while the herders keep an anxious lookout for lurking crocodiles. Among the tall reeds of the swamps, a small boy fishes, oblivious of the drama of the hippopotamus hunt at the other end of the boat. The Greek historian Herodotus, when he visited Egypt long after its days of imperial greatness, in fact at about the year 450 BC, was amazed at the Egyptian feeling for animals. They didn't seem to think of them as a separate species to men. Very shocking to a Greek. And he tells how, when a house is on fire, the first thing the Egyptians do is to save the cats. They hand them from one person to another while the house burns down. In all this there may be some element of totemism, but totemism alone doesn't account for their amazing curiosity about different kinds of birds and fishes. There are said to be 18 kinds of bird and 15 kinds of fishes represented in the tomb of Ti. Nor does it explain the delicate sympathy with which every species is observed. From these reliefs, we know more about life in ancient Egypt than we do about any other early society, because the Egyptians were, from the first, a profoundly visual people. In Egypt, one is tempted to paraphrase the opening words of St. John's Gospel and say, "In the beginning was the image, and the image was with God, and the image was God." Even their writing consisted in a series of visual experiences, pictograms that turned into letters, consonants only, there were no vowels. These beautiful little images must be the most uneconomical form of writing ever invented, even more so than the Chinese ideogram, and sooner or later they were superseded by two simpler forms of script. Very early they came to be recorded on another Egyptian invention, papyrus. The papyrus plant grew all along the Nile in ancient times. Its tough stems are often 10 feet in height. The Egyptians cut them into strips like this, soaked them, dried them, and simply pressed them together in a crisscross pattern. No other adhesive was used. One can see the crisscrossing of the strips if one holds up a bit of papyrus to the light. There it is. The result was an extremely tough and durable form of writing material. Much of it has survived. Here's an example. Papyrus was used all over the Mediterranean world for more than 2,000 years until the Chinese invention of paper superseded it. The Egyptians continued to use the carved hieroglyphs for all ceremonial inscriptions, and, like Chinese calligraphy, they are a beautiful form of decoration. Only, unlike Chinese calligraphy, they are always the same, and they don't allow for individual expression. Because their script consisted of stereotyped images, the Egyptians could not achieve verbal abstraction. So they never created a philosophy in the Greek sense of the word. They could not speculate on the meaning of words. But one can't say that they were unable to form concepts, because all their visual experience was subjected to strict underlying form and geometrical schemes. The pyramids. They've got Egypt a bad name. You remember pictures in the Children's Encyclopedia of hundreds of slaves pulling huge blocks under the lash of a briar. It is possibly true, as Herodotus counts, that the Great Pyramid demanded the labor of 100,000 men for 20 years. But the blocks floated up to the site during the flooding of the Nile, and these men were not slaves or prisoners. We even know what they were paid. The whole exercise may well have been undertaken in an almost devotional spirit, like building a great medieval cathedral, a monument to their god-king. According to Petrie, some of the masonry is so fine that blocks weighing many tons are set together with seams showing a joint 1/1000th of an inch, equal to opticians' work of the present day, but on a scale of acres instead of inches of material. The blocks were cut by bronze saws with diamond edges, and the Great Pyramid consists of 2,300,000 blocks. Napoleon, when he saw it, calculated that with the stones of the 3 pyramids he could build a wall 10 feet high and a foot wide all round France. For nearly 4,000 years, until the 19th century, the Great Pyramid was the tallest building in the world. Well, in the end it does seem somewhat unimaginative to devote so much labor to mere size. They look like brutal assertions of power until one sees them. Then one realizes that these vast exhibitions of solid geometry were perhaps the only things that could hold their own at the junction of cultivated Egypt and the annihilating desert that stretches interminably to the west. I don't suppose that its builder, Khafor, commonly known as Cheops, thought of it in that light. He thought of it partly as an assertion of power, and partly as a safe resting place for his body, which unfortunately it was not, because Egyptian tomb robbers had more time and quite as much expertise as modern safe breakers. And he also thought of it, as did his subjects, as an indestructible assertion of faith, and this it has proved to be. The pyramids, which the poet Blake thought of as the essence of materialism, are in their way religious buildings. Religious also is that other familiar image that crouches in front of them, the Sphinx. For centuries it was hidden under the sand. It isn't even mentioned by the Greek historian Herodotus. When it was discovered by Napoleon's expedition, it was restored, and the nose fell off. The nose is in the British Museum. Subsequent restorations have made things worse. It's a god and not a pharaoh, but which god we do not know. The sculpture of 2500 BC shows the same confidence and energy that went to build the pyramids. When I look at small children hopping and bouncing, I think, that's got to last them 70 years. The energy of the old kingdom lasted 700. In this group, the pharaoh Mycerinus is accompanied by two female figures, a goddess named Hathor and the embodiment of a province called a nome, who was important because the administration of Egypt depended very much on regional government. In fact, regional autonomy was the cause of the growth of the old kingdom. Another group by the same sculptor shows Mycerinus and his wife. See, she is treated as his equal. The days when wives of the pharaohs were tiny figures at their feet are 1,000 years away.
Welcome to Legends Unlocked, where ancient myths breathe again. We begin in the heart of Egypt, a land of gods and mysteries, the feather of Ma'at, the judgment of the heart, the secrets of the afterlife. But this is only the beginning. We will travel from Nile to Norse, from pyramids to palaces, unlocking legends from every corner of the world. Every myth holds a truth, every symbol a message, every legend a lesson. Join us on this journey through time, mystery, and meaning. Subscribe now and unlock the wisdom of the ancients.
Corporation. There's the same sense of a steady nerve Prime Minister and Inspector of Buildings. He is modern man, with all his subtlety and complexity. The figures in Boston, and during the last war, when the Americans feared a bomb attack, the director of the museum, before putting him into the vaults, dressed him in modern clothes and had him photographed to show that man had not changed much in 4,500 years. The village mayor, found in the tomb of Ka-Apa, Saqqara, is a little more localized to the eastern Mediterranean. You might interview him in his Cairo office today. And you might meet the rather odious Prince Ra-Hotep in the streets. Even the famous scribe in the Louvre, although more idealized, is an individual portrait. And here I may digress to say that the word scribe is misleading. This was the accepted way of representing a civil servant. And the large number of figures in this pose is an indication of the vast importance of the bureaucracy in early Egypt. The early Egyptian interest in humanity was not confined to counselors and civil servants. From almost the first, they began to do small figures of ordinary people at work. Here are two of the first. And you see that, as well as being beautiful pieces of small sculpture, they show a touching sensibility to the character of the actual workers. In the ancient world, this response to ordinary working people is uniquely Egyptian. One wouldn't expect to find it in Babylonian or Assyrian art, but it doesn't exist in Greece either. Working people were slaves whose activities were not worth recording except as comic characters in drama. However, I must admit that the grandest and most confident of all Egyptian portraits goes a little further. This portrait of Pharaoh Khephren must be the noblest effigy of a ruler ever made. This feeling of composure and indestructible self-confidence lasted 700 years, much longer than the Roman Empire. Then there was a social revolution, darkness and destruction, which, to judge from the few surviving documents, seems to have been like the Dark Ages in Western Europe. The lights came on again in the period known as the Middle Kingdom, but Egypt had lost some of its confidence. The portraits of the pharaohs become more thoughtful. They show a vie intérieure, a discovery of melancholy, of the burden of the soul, very different from the bouncing heartiness of the old kingdom. Ra, the simple extrovert god of the sun, becomes less representative than Osiris, god who was murdered by his brother and resurrected, the god who presided over the dead. Egypt once more established a great empire, but one sees in this little chapel of Sesostris how much more complex and tender was Pharaoh's relationship with the gods. Almost every relief shows Sesostris drawing inspiration and spiritual strength from the physical potency of the god. And above the reliefs are these panels of the most beautiful hieroglyphics. I think almost the most beautiful of the whole of Egyptian art. These reliefs also show what was to become one of the most life-enhancing achievements of Egyptian art, the cult of physical beauty. This Middle Kingdom lady is already a sort of Mona Lisa, only more appealing to our eyes. And a little later, my goodness, what beauties. These men and girls in the tomb of Ramosi are actually early New Kingdom, but they are descended from almost equally beautiful grandmothers. Was there ever such elegance and refinement? Perhaps in the Kore of 6th century Greece, or among the Gothic Madonnas. And the longer you look at them, the more you realize that, like the Greek Kore, they're all subtly different from one another. The anxiety that one sees in the portraits of the Middle Kingdom was justified. Egyptian civilization collapsed again, this time from external invasion, and once more renewed itself. A series of warrior pharaohs, adopting the new weapon of the chariot, drove out the invaders and established a great empire. This was the so-called New Kingdom, new in the year 1590 BC. It's not as creative, nor as human as the Old Kingdom, but architecture reached new heights of magnificence. This is Hatshepsut's temple in the hills near Thebes. It's worth remembering that this is at the same date as the ferocious beginnings of Chinese art. Before these pillars, one can't help exclaiming once more, how Greek! It's over 1,000 years before the Parthenon. But in 1378 BC, there took place the strangest incident in Egyptian history, the reign of the man who came to be known as Akhenaten and who changed the state religion. There are two conflicting types of portrait of Akhenaten. This one, a sensitive, intelligent face like a Botticelli, or perhaps the death mask of Keats. The other, more idiosyncratic, a long, attenuated head where the sensitivity borders on neurasthenia. And he still excites conflicting feelings. Some Egyptologists call him an overrated crank or fanatic. Others call him a religious genius and the first individual in history. I think the last proposition is true. He was determined to bring Egypt back to the worship of a single god, which he believed had been the practice of the Old Kingdom. The god was called Ra-Aten, the sun, and there was already a considerable following for his worship in Heliopolis. But Akhenaten did it with a passionate single-mindedness that very seldom works in public affairs. He built a new capital of the empire and called it Akhetaten, and he gave up his life and that of his beautiful and intelligent queen Nefertiti to worshipping the sun. The large, ritualistic figures of him, like this one in Cairo, made older historians speak of him as a misshapen epileptic. And I confess it is rather disturbing. I think it must contain some part of the truth, because these wonderful sculpture sketches of him suggest the same kind of quasi-hysterical face. There must have been some genetic oddity, because his daughters, whose likenesses we know from these exquisite small sculpture sketches, have the same very odd-shaped heads. Incidentally, Akhenaten was one of the very few pharaohs whose parents were not related. But his wife, Nefertiti, was never caricatured in this way, and remains the most beautiful woman who has come down to us from the past. Whatever else his religious convictions may have done, they had a liberating effect on art. He allowed himself and his family to be portrayed with unprecedented intimacy. Here he is embracing one of his daughters. far from the formal pose of a pharaoh. After his death, although craftsmanship remained unsurpassed, this is his daughter and son-in-law Tutankhamun, inspiration vanished, along with the worship of the single god. Akhenaten was also a poet whose hymn to the sun has come down to us in an inscription. It has an astonishing likeness to the hymn to the sun by the greatest religious genius of medieval Christianity, St. Francis. Bright is the earth when thou risest in the horizon, all trees and plants flourish, the birds flutter in their marshes, their wings uplifted in adoration of thee, the sheep dance upon their shone upon them. The chicklet crieth in the eggshell, thou givest him breath therein to preserve him alive. When thou hast perfected him, that he may pierce the egg, he cometh forth to chirp with all his might. O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom thou hast made them all. The earth is full of thy creatures. That last versicle is from the 104th Psalm, but it is almost word for word the same as some other lines in Akhenaten's hymn. And of course, it raises the question whether the monotheism of Akhenaten could be the origin of the monotheism of the Jews. Unfortunately, the captivity of Israel in Egypt, which is the linchpin of Jewish history and religion, seems to have left no impression at all on the Egyptians. No mention of a Semitic vizier called Joseph, no mention of the 10 plagues, no mention of Moses, not even a hint. We can't guess to within 500 years when the whole episode took place. The first indisputable mention of Israel in an Egyptian document occurs just over 1,000 years after the death of Akhenaten. It is tempting to believe that the Jews took Akhenaten's monotheism with them to the desert of Sinai, and thus that the spiritual enlightenment of Akhenaten that failed so disastrously in his own country was ultimately to become the faith of the Western world and of Islam. But I fear that it's no more than a historian's dream. And in fact, the greater part of Judaic literature is far more Mesopotamian in spirit than Egyptian. Akhenaten's experiment was bound to fail. The Egyptian empire was overstretched and needed a man of action to defend it. Previous pharaohs had kept their positions by balancing the powers of the army and the priesthood, and Akhenaten had defended them both. They managed to get rid of him. Exactly how, we don't know. They razed his capital to the ground and moved the court back to Thebes, the great center of the cult of Amun. There followed the great centuries of Egyptian imperialism. The 3 pharaohs called Ramesses were warriors and conquerors. In a sense, the creative element of Egyptian civilization was lost. Imperialism involves uniformity, bureaucracy, military castes, all the things that are hostile to original genius. We've reached the age of gigantic temples. This is the entrance to the Luxor temple with its inevitable obelisk, one of a pair which the other is in the Place de la Concorde. The great courtyard is really one of the most beautiful pieces of Egyptian architecture. It is considerably bigger than any European cathedral, but it's quite small and modest compared with the gigantic complex of Karnak. What a place. As one walks between these serried rows of rams, much too close together, and approaches the enormous entrance, one feels alternately crushed and elated. The Hall of Columns is one of the wonders of the world, but no camera can give any idea of its size and complexity. It's said that over 100 men can stand on the top of each of these pillars. There are 122 of these enormous columns, with 12 even bigger ones down the middle, about 70 feet high. And how thick? Well, you can see when I try to put my hands around them. We are told that the whole of Canterbury Cathedral could be fitted into this single hall. Originally, the columns were rough, like the two end ones, but they were smooth and faced with a stone which allowed for a special kind of relief carving with a deep incision all round the outlines to give them carrying power. These reliefs are, for the most part, very able pieces of sculpture. No, more than able, impressive by their combination of energy and a sense of beauty. The dominant sweep of Ramesses II's shoulder, contrasting with his crown, is a splendid, vigorous, formal invention, and what a classical beauty he is. And yet, after an hour or two, these reliefs become exhausting, even oppressive, and after walking round the whole enormous area, one begins to feel, oh, not another relief, for Pete's sake. The reason? Because they are propaganda, repeated as relentlessly as propaganda in Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia, although with a good deal more art. If repetition was the essence of propaganda, they certainly achieve it. And Ramesses' propaganda image spread everywhere, even as far as Abu Simbel. One could call Ramesses II the Napoleon of Egypt, the insatiable conqueror obsessed by la gloire. His tomb has been rifled as usual. Only his mummy was left, and as you see, he lived a good deal longer than Napoleon, almost as long as Mr. Rockefeller. He built himself a funerary temple, considerably larger and grander than Napoleon's tomb in Les Invalides. It contains some magnificent fragments and the usual reliefs, and one of these shows Ramesses the Conqueror with his horse-drawn chariots causing indescribable confusion in the enemy. One looks at it without much sympathy. And then one turns one's head and sees this gigantic figure fallen to the ground, but still majestic. Here's the shoulder, and over there is the ruined head. The whole thing is said to have weighed over 1,000 tons. And walking round it, one realizes what an amazing sense of form the Egyptian sculptors retained even in this age of authoritarianism. One mightn't have liked the figure so much when it was standing upright. On its side, it's a magnificent piece of abstract sculpture. Well, eventually the tide of history turned and swallowed Egypt, as it has done all civilizations. Is there anything for us to learn from it besides the nostalgic pleasure of looking at these great ruins? I think there is. I'm standing between two of the most famous monuments of Egyptian art, the so-called Colossi of Memnon. Every early traveler visited them, including the Emperor Hadrian, who had a eulogy inscribed on one of their knees. Throughout all these centuries, the colossi used to rise out of green grass. When I first saw them, there were little black goats skipping round them in the grass. Now, the famous high dam, built out of the noblest motives, has prevented the Nile from carrying down its silt, so instead of grass there is mud. The double-edged sword of technology has ruined a natural process that had worked perfectly for 5,000 years. Surely there is a lesson for us in this. The long triumph of Egypt depended on her respect for the natural order of things, the yearly return of the life-giving waters of the Nile. The civilization of the Old Kingdom was based on renewal, the husbanding of nature, not, as ours has been, on a greedy expansion and exploitation of resources. Nowadays we're told that it's discreditable to look backwards and try to find inspiration in the arts and beliefs and moral standards of the past. We're told that man has changed. Well, he hasn't. And nor has woman. Technology, although it may ruin us, is not going to remove our deep-seated need for order and harmony, or the feeling of sympathy for our fellow creatures, both human and animal, or the belief, for which we have no rational grounds, that some part of us is immortal. These ideas first found expression 5,000 years ago, and even if they are lost for a time, we can renew them, as the Egyptians did.
Welcome to Legends Unlocked, where ancient myths breathe again. We begin in the heart of Egypt, a land of gods and mysteries, the feather of Ma'at, the judgment of the heart, the secrets of the afterlife. But this is only the beginning. We will travel from Nile to Norse, from pyramids to palaces, unlocking legends from every corner of the world. Every myth holds a truth, every symbol a message, every legend a lesson. Join us on this journey through time, mystery, and meaning. Subscribe now and unlock the wisdom of the ancients.
Luxor Temple is a large and complex ancient Egyptian temple located on the east bank of the Nile River in the city of Luxor, historically known as Thebes. It was founded around 1400 BCE. The temple was built for the god Ammonius-Ra, his consort Mut, and their son Khonsu. Construction of Luxor Temple took place during the reigns of kings from the 18th and 19th dynasties. The most significant structures within the temple were built by kings Amenhotep III and Ramses II. Ramses II added the open courtyard, the monumental pylon, the grand gateway, and 2 obelisks. King Thutmose III built chapels dedicated to the Theban triad, Ammonius, Mut, Khonsu, and Tutankhamun completed the wall inscriptions. The original triple shrine, built during the reigns of Queen Hatshepsut and King Thutmose III of the 18th dynasty, was later destroyed but then rebuilt by Ramses II. The temple is also known as Ipit Resit, meaning the southern sanctuary or the place of Ammonius-Ra, and is considered one of the best preserved and most beautifully constructed Egyptian temples, exemplifying classic Egyptian temple design. During the Middle Kingdom period, The site where Amenhotep III built the current temple contained remains of an older temple and a sacred chapel likely dating back to the 12th dynasty. Amenhotep III is credited with building the temple in its current form on the east bank of the Nile, aligned on a north-south axis. Queen Hatshepsut and King Thutmose III constructed a small building with 3 chapels dedicated to the Theban triad. It is believed that Ramses II rebuilt these chapels and inscribed his name on them. Ramses II, a 19th dynasty ruler, added a large pylon and behind it a spacious courtyard lined with papyrus columned colonnades. Ancient architects typically oriented temples on the east bank of the Nile along a west-east axis and those on the west bank along an east-west axis. However, Luxor Temple on the east bank is uniquely aligned along a north-south axis, possibly to align with the nearby Karnak Temple complex to the north and the Avenue of Sphinxes, Avenue of the Rams, connecting the 2 temples. It is likely that Ramses II's architects adjusted the axes of the additions he made, including the pylon and courtyard, to fit with the earlier constructions by Amenhotep III and the rebuilt triple shrine from the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Amenhotep III is believed to have commissioned the temple dedicated to the Theban triad for 2 main reasons. First, to emphasize his divine lineage from Ammonius himself, and second, to appease the powerful priests of Ammonius to gain their acceptance as the legitimate pharaoh of Egypt. Thus, the temple was dedicated to Ammonius and his divine image. The entrance to Luxor Temple is marked by the first pylon, standing 24 meters high, built by Ramses II. This pylon is decorated with scenes of Ramses II's military victories, notably the Battle of Kadesh. Later pharaohs, especially those of the 25th dynasty, also recorded their triumphs here. Two massive pink granite obelisks once stood before Ramses II's pylon. One of these obelisks now adorns the Place de la Concorde in Paris and weighs approximately 220 tons. The eastern obelisk, still standing before the northern pylon, weighs around 257 tons and is notable for the carved monkeys on its base, depicted worshipping the sun at sunrise. Both obelisks bear hieroglyphic inscriptions of Ramses II's names and titles and show him offering sacrifices at their apexes. These obelisks not only symbolized the sun and proclaimed the temple's location from afar, but also had pointed tops likely covered with a gold-plated copper layer, keeping them gleaming and radiant. Ramses II also constructed the massive pylon at the temple's entrance, measuring 65 meters wide and 24 meters high. On its western wing, deep reliefs depict Ramses II's battles against the Hittites in his 5th regnal year. The scenes include Ramses with his military advisors, the defeated enemy camp, and the king in his chariot amid battle. On the eastern wing, Ramses is shown in his war chariot raining arrows down upon fleeing Hittite enemies, with the battlefield strewn with dead and wounded. In the far north of this wing is a depiction of the Hittite prince of Kadesh, portrayed as frightened in his chariot. A poetic description of the battle, written in ancient Egyptian, extends from the right western wing to the eastern wing's lower part. The The pylon's facade contains 4 vertical niches, 2 on each wing, designed to hold flagpoles, and 4 openings at the top where the flagpoles were secured. In front of the pylon were originally 6 colossal statues of Ramses II, 4 standing and 2 seated on either side of the entrance. Only 1 standing statue remains, positioned on the far right from the interior perspective. The 2 seated statues flanking the doorway show Ramses II on his throne. The sides of the throne display scenes symbolizing the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. A small statue of Queen Nefertari appears beside the left-seated statue, and a statue of a princess beside the right one. The bases of both statues are carved with images of prisoners and their names inscribed on their chests. Each statue is approximately 14 meters tall. Ramses II also built the temple's courtyard, measuring 57 meters long and 51 meters wide. Notably, the courtyard's axis deviates eastward from the temple's main axis, possibly to face Karnak Temple or to avoid the chapels constructed earlier by Hatshepsut and Thutmose III in the current location. The courtyard is surrounded by porticos, each supported by 2 rows of papyrus columns. This avenue is a paved road flanked by rows of Sphinx statues representing King Nectanebo I of the 30th dynasty, who established this path during his reign. The avenue led to the Temple of Khonsu, located south of Karnak temples, replacing the earlier Avenue of Rams, Avenue of the Sphinxes, dating back to the reign of Amenhotep III, as evidenced by some statues bearing Amenhotep III's name near Khonsu Temple's southern gate. Each Sphinx statue was carved from a single block of sandstone, depicting a lion's body with King Nectanebo's head, placed on rectangular bases. The purpose of the Avenue of the Sphinxes was to delineate the procession route, whether royal or divine, and to emphasize its axis visually.
Welcome to Legends Unlocked, where ancient myths breathe again. We begin in the heart of Egypt, a land of gods and mysteries, the feather of Ma'at, the judgment of the heart, the secrets of the afterlife. But this is only the beginning. We will travel from Nile to Norse, from pyramids to palaces, unlocking legends from every corner of the world. Every myth holds a truth, every symbol a message, every legend a lesson. Join us on this journey through time, mystery, and meaning. Subscribe now and unlock the wisdom of the ancients. legends unlocked, where ancient myths breathe again. We begin in the heart of Egypt, a land of gods and mysteries, the feather of Ma'at, the judgment of the heart, the secrets of the afterlife. But this is only the beginning. We will travel from Nile to Norse, from pyramids to palaces, unlocking legends from every corner of the world. Every myth holds a truth, every symbol a message, every legend a lesson. Join us on this journey through time, mystery, and meaning. Subscribe now and unlock the wisdom of the ancients.